Hello and welcome to another week of RSA 556. I hope everyone is happy that we made it through our midterm exam. I do want to point out that that is our only major exam for this semester. Moving forward, we'll still have a couple of big assignments left, such as the book review assignment, which we posted last week and you submitted to me, and our conference realignment assignment, which is open, but we haven't really talked too much about it. In fact, that conference realignment assignment is going to serve as our final exam. So that we're through this first half of the semester. We'll continue to have weekly assignments here and there, but those will be our only two big assignments that we have left. Today, what I want to do is focus on ethics in intercollegiate athletics. And I'm assuming most people listening to this have taken an ethics class before or had ethics talked about in other contexts. But what I'm hoping that you haven't had a lot of exposure to is conversations about how ethics applies to the governance systems of intercollegiate athletics, and more specifically, how ethics and ethical decision making plays a key role in leadership at all levels of college sport. Today, we're going to have a conversation not only defining ethics and ethical theories, but also talking about specific situations in which ethical theories and ethical perspectives might be applied in the current realm of college athletics. Now, we're not going to talk through each of them in depth, but I'll present a number to you and I'll show you how we can use this line of ethical inquiry to break down situations and look at things from multiple perspectives. But before we get to that, I want to begin, as we so often do, with first offering a series of definitions. Because even though I assume most people listening to this have had exposure to ethics in the past, some of you might have only had a peripheral experience with it. And so I want to make sure that we're all approaching our conversation today from the same perspective. And that perspective begins with first defining what ethics are. Now, as I show here, ethics is a systematic study of values that guide individual decision making. Ethics refers to principles of the concept of right or wrong. What is the right conduct or what is the wrong conduct in a decision-making setting? The interesting thing about ethics is there is no wrong answer. Rather, ethics serves as a conversation. Now, within this initial definition, we note the word values. And we point values out specifically because we say ethics is a systematic study of values that guide our decision making. So then we need to move and say, well, what are values? And our values are things that we hold important, such as family, education, happiness. All of those can be considered different values. And in the management context, we talk about values as shaping the mission of an organization. But in the ethics context, we talk about values shaping our view of the world, which then ties in to our decision-making process and what we think of as right or wrong. But another way to think about values is to think about the word morals, because our values are based off our morals. So then we have to ask the question, well, what are morals? Well, morals are a fundamental baseline that dictate what behavior we deem to be appropriate in a given situation or given setting. Now, most of us have our morals based off of the society and the community in which we were raised and in which we grew up, because morals are based off of our life experiences. They're based off our family, our upbringing, our personal beliefs. Oftentimes, these get tied into one's religion. Because if you think about religion, it teaches us what is right and what is wrong. What is the appropriate behavior or the appropriate thing to do in a given context or a given situation, and what is the inappropriate thing to do. So it's important to note out that individuals in different communities might have different moral base because their upbringing might be different. Their background, their personal experiences might be different. Our perception of morals often change throughout our lifetime, though there are some core ones that we hold on to, such as murder is wrong. But as we gain more experiences, as we age, those experiences tend to shift, at least to a degree, what those perceptions are, because we realize that the world is not as straightforward. It's not as black and white as we believed as a child, but rather there's all these areas of grays. So morals then tie into our belief and understanding of ethics. Another way of saying it is ethics is actually a philosophy of morals. And a philosophy is just a system of thought. It's a search for wisdom. So in ethics, we're searching through all these different morals to try to understand how we should act within a different or within a given situation. Put most basically, the definition that I like the most is as follows. Ethical inquiry deals with questions and issues of value, where value is understood in the sense of goodness or the rightness and badness or wrongness of our actions. Ethics is therefore a normative or perspective form of inquiry rather than a descriptive one, since it is concerned more with how human agents ought to treat one another rather than with how, in fact, they are treating one another. Now, a couple important things to point out within this definition. First, it's important to note that the idea of good and bad is different than the idea of right and wrong. And that difference really comes into play as we move forward in our conversation and start to discuss ethical theory. Because one deals with looking at the actions themselves and saying whether the action was the correct action to take or not. And one deals with the outcome of those actions, whether that outcome is good or bad. So hold on to that thought for a second. But the second part of this definition is really important when we talk about how we start to apply ethics and ethical inquiry within the realm of business or within the realm of sport management, because it says it is concerned more with how human agents ought to treat one another, rather with how in fact they are, which means ethical conversation is often forward-looking. We might take into consideration and value what's happened in the past, but we're trying to have a conversation so that we can dictate what is the appropriate steps or the appropriate course of action to take as we move forward. While we might judge what's happened in the past, that's not what the conversation should focus on. It should focus on forward-looking ideals. But getting back to this notion of good and bad versus right and wrong and understanding how those things are different. Generally, when you have an ethics conversation or you take an ethics course, you'll spend a considerable amount of time, maybe days or weeks, talking about different ethical theories, about different ways that we can approach different situations to try to discern how individuals ought to act. Today, we're going to highlight three major ethical theories that generally serve as the foundation for most other ethical theories. The first one being a teleological view of ethics. The second one being a deontological view of ethics, and the third one being the virtue view or virtue ethics. Beginning with the teleological view. If you actually look at the word teleology, the root of that word is teleos. It's a Greek root meaning the end or goal. Within the teleological view of ethics, the goal, the outcome that we want from the situation that we are evaluating is we want the most good. That's it. The idea of teleological ethics is we are doing whatever it takes to promote the most good or the thing that is most desired. So we look at a set of actions that are taken, and the question we ask ourselves is those or did or will those course of actions lead to the greatest possible good? Therefore, whether something is right or wrong, whether the action is right or wrong, is only based on a review of the outcome and how good or bad that individual outcome is. The major question then, with the teleological view of ethics or the teleological approach to ethics, is what is good? Because if we're trying to promote the most good, we need to then have an understanding of what it means, of what good is, if that's the thing that we are trying to promote. Well, according to DeCenzi and Rossberger, good is concerned with morally good properties of human behavior, as well as states such as pleasure and experiences of beauty, both of which are thought to be intrinsically good things. So good deals with the general properties that we ascribe as humans to being good, which includes intrinsic feelings such as happiness, love, pleasure. We could add a whole other bunch of value statements to this. But think about things that happen that make you feel good from a very general sense. Well, hopefully, in this introduction, you can see that there's potential issues with our definition and our view of good. Because if we're talking about good as an intrinsic thing, something that's happening inside of us, that means what is good for me might be very different than what is good for you, which means our definition by its very nature is unclear. It's ambiguous. It changes from one person to another, which makes it very challenging oftentimes to take a teleological view because my perceptions of the outcome of the most desirable good thing might be different from your perceptions. So it's important when we take this approach that we have a conversation about that outcome that's happening and the good that we are trying to do. That way, individuals can make sure they're approaching it from the same standpoint and not just taking into consideration their intrinsic values or the things that they ascribe for. The other major problem with this approach deals with ignoring the issues of what is happening to lead to that outcome, ignoring the actions and focusing only on the outcome. Because so often as humans, we focus on all aspects of a decision-making process, not only the good that we are trying to do, but also the steps of actions that it might take to get to that good. And so often within our human perspective, we not only evaluate the outcome, we also go and evaluate the steps or the series of things that were done to get to the outcome. With a teleological view of ethics, we cannot do that. We have to ignore whether the actions themselves are right or wrong, because we don't concern ourselves with that within this viewpoint. This becomes very problematic, it becomes very challenging to do. And so how do we combat this issue? How do we stay away from looking at the rightness or wrongness of the actions? Well, we take an amoral understanding of the world. Well, what does it mean to take an amoral understanding? Well, anytime we put the prefix a in front of a word, it just means lacking. So an amoral sense of the world just means we take a stance where we don't value those sets of actions. We don't judge the morality of the actions themselves. This can be pretty challenging. So let's talk about it from an example standpoint. Imagine I said health or being healthy is good in and of itself. That is a statement that I make that most people would agree with. How can we take that statement, being healthy is good in and of itself, how can we consider that from an amoral perspective? Well, we can look at it and say, because the act of being healthy in and of itself is unconcerned with any type of outcome, any type of consequence, the action itself is amoral. The only way we can judge whether being healthy is good or bad is to look at the outcome we are trying to achieve and then ask ourselves, does being healthy help us attain that outcome? So if I tell you the outcome we are trying to achieve is that we are trying to lower our health costs, well, being healthy helps us to lower the health cost. Therefore, it is a ethical action to take. Because from a teleological perspective, the action allowed us to attain the outcome we wanted. Being healthy allowed us to lower our healthcare costs. So regardless of the fact that we generally think of health as a good thing, within teleology, we don't concern ourselves with that. We ask, what is the outcome we are trying to achieve? And did that action help us achieve it? If it's yes, then it's the correct thing to do. If it's no, then it's not the correct thing to do, regardless of the morality of the act itself. So putting this another way, a teleologist would claim that an individual has a moral obligation to promote whatever amoral good is deemed most worthwhile. Where the process used to get to the good is right or wrong does not matter. The only thing that matters is the outcome. So on balance, one should seek the greatest measure of this good over its opposite. So, the main takeaway here, if you are an individual who takes a teleological approach to ethical situations or ethical conversations, the only thing you are concerning yourself with is the outcome. As long as the outcome is good, then the actions are good as well. How do we get to that outcome from a managerial standpoint? I choose the steps, regardless of if we think they're right or wrong. I choose the actions that will maximize the outcome that we are trying to achieve. Now, a lot of you might start to think of this and have problems, but we can actually take this and subdivide this down even more. And we can classify the outcomes that we are trying to seek and create sub-theories of teleological ethics. The first one being egoism. The second one being utilitarianism. Egoism is pretty straightforward. The outcome that we are trying to achieve, if we subscribe to egoism, is an outcome that is intrinsically good to the individual in question. Whatever benefits that person the most, we take the series of outcomes to benefit that person. So if I am an egoist, that means the only thing that I'm trying to get at in decision making are things that are going to benefit me personally. I don't care if my actions hurt other people. I don't care about anyone else. All I care about is myself. So I might lie, cheat, or steal if it helps improve my station in life and it makes me happy and it allows me to move up the corporate ladder. An egoist would say that's perfectly acceptable. That's perfectly ethical. The problem with this, I think, is fairly self-evident, but it's important to point out, if we're only considering ourselves, then we're not taking into consideration anyone else. And so in doing that, we might actually cause a lot of harm to other individuals. There actually is an opposite to egoism called altruism. And in that case, the outcome that we are trying to seek is the series of actions that will lead to the most good for everyone. In the utilitarianism approach, the outcome that we are trying to seek is the one that is most, or the series of actions that will cause the most pleasure or happiness. So the only moral duty you have within a utilitarianism perspective, the only duty that we have is to try to promote and create as much happiness as possible, not just for myself, but for everyone. Now, hopefully, some of you realize within this conversation that this approach has some application within sport. And in fact, we can look at some very common sayings like no harm, no foul, or maybe win at all cost. These two very common statements that are used all the time in the world of sports actually demonstrate a teleological approach to ethics. And what we're saying within both of these is we don't care about the actions that are taken. The only thing we value is the outcome. And the outcome that we are truly seeking in sports participation or in sporting activities is to win. That's the goal. And so anything I do that helps me to win is seen as being ethical from a teleological perspective. So if I cheat, if I do steroids, as long as the steroids help me win, the action itself is amoral. It doesn't matter. If doing steroids helps me win, then all of a sudden I can justify and say it's ethical. This is probably a perception that individuals like Lance Armstrong took. If you're not familiar with Lance Armstrong, very famous cyclist, maybe one of the most famous cyclists in history, got testicular and brain cancer, was given like a 5% chance to live, ends up battling back and surviving his cancer. Comes all the way back to enter it back into the Tour de France, one of the most famous sporting events in the world. It's a massive competition where you're cycling throughout the whole country of France. And before he entered, there was only one American who had ever won the Tour de France. He enters it and not only wins it, but he wins it for 7 straight years. It was so unprecedented. He set the record by so much that people made a ton of accusations against him, claiming that he was doping, not only blood doping, using EPO, all of these things. And he continuously denied it. And in the process of denying it, he sued people. He ruined reporters' careers. All to eventually come out years later to finally admit with Oprah that he was in fact cheating. But I could look at that situation from a teleological perspective and say, you know what? Yes, maybe what he did was right or wrong. That doesn't matter. Everything he did was done so that he could win the competitions. And he maximized his ability to win. He maximized the good that he could do for himself. Therefore, all the actions he took could be considered ethical. Same thing as this like no harm, no foul approach. You know, if I'm playing a basketball game back in the day, it's very famous to do the hack a Shaq or hack a Howard. In basketball, you foul someone consistently who's very bad at free throws, and you put them at the line so that they miss shots and you can have a chance to win the game. Well, I could say that's a win at all costs or no harm, no foul. Yes, I might be stretching the letter of the rules or the letter or the stretching the intent behind the rules in place. But I'm doing it to help me win. And therefore, if I only care about the outcome from a teleological perspective, those actions are perfectly justifiable and fine. What about from more of a managerial perspective? Imagine that you're an athletic director at a big time university and you have a donor come in and give you $100,000 and they earmark it and they say that the money has to be used towards renovating university locker rooms or renovating athletic team locker rooms. That's it. That's the only thing they say. So you decide that you have two courses of actions that you could take. The first course of action says you could take all $100,000 and give it to the men's football team and renovate their locker rooms. You could give them a new sauna. You could put a bunch of 70-inch flat screen TVs up around the locker room. You could put a new Xbox in every single locker. That's option A. Option B is you split the money in half and you put $50,000 into the men's locker room and you get them a new sauna. They don't get any new TVs now. They don't get any Xboxes, just the sauna. And then you take the other $50,000 and you put it in the women's soccer locker room and you give them a new sauna. So the question would be, what approach should you take? What set of actions do you think are most appropriate? And if we approach this from an ethical perspective, from a purely teleological viewpoint, where all we care about is doing the most good, we need to ask ourselves then, well, what does it mean to do good in this situation? And there isn't really a right answer. One person could say, well, doing the most good means supplying resources to the team that generates the greatest revenue for the university, which is the football team. So if I put all the money into the football team's locker room, that's the action, then that will produce happier football players. It will give us a recruiting edge to get better talent in, which means we'll win more games, which means we'll generate more money. That's perfectly acceptable and justifiable approach to take and reasoning to have with a teleological view. But you could also argue the opposite. You could also argue for option B and say, well, no, good in this sense is making the most people happy. Well, if I only put resources into men's programs, into the football programs, that might be 125 student athletes that are happy. But if I split the resources and I put 50,000 into men and 50,000 into women, now not only do I have the 125 student athletes that are happy on the men's football team, I also now have 30 women's soccer players that are happy. So I've increased the amount of happiness, the amount of good that I can do. So when we're taking a teleological perspective, the important thing to highlight here is we need to define what the outcome is that we are trying to seek. What is the good that we are trying to do? And we'll come up with this again once we start talking about some specific example of ethical conversations or ethical dilemmas that are currently facing intercollegiate athletic governing systems and leaders. Now, if you're listening to this theory and you're thinking, this doesn't sound right, if you're listening and you're thinking, I see a lot of problems and issues with this approach, you're exactly right. Your thoughts have some value. And this is exactly what Immanuel Kant thought when he was approaching and considering and debating and discussing ethics. So he proposed a second ethical theory called deontological ethics, or the deontological approach. And here, the word deon is the Greek root word, which means duty. Now, if you've taken a law course before, the term duty is used quite a bit when we talk about legal aspects of recreation and sport. Because we talk about negligence, and the first legal element of negligence is defining the duty. In that class, we talk about a duty being a set of actions that you are supposed to take in a given situation. That's the same definition here. A duty in this sense, in a deontological ethics sense, just means we look at the actions that an individual should do, and we judge the ethics of the situation by identifying, debating, and defining the individual actions as right or wrong. Versus, in the teleological view, we look at only the outcomes. Here, we focus on the duties. We focus on the actions that should be taken. So in this sense, something is only ethical if the actions someone takes are righteous, if they themselves are ethical. It might not lead to the greatest outcome. However, it means that we are doing the right thing along the way. Just like teleological ethics, deontological ethics has its own set of issues, such as how do we define duty? How do we know how people should act? Well, for the most part, we define duty, we define how people should act based oftentimes off some type of superior being or supreme being, or some type of commandment that comes from God. So in the Judeo-Christian sense, God leads and gives us, or in the Judeo-Christian sense, God sends us 10 commandments. And he says, these are the things that you should do. This is how you should act. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not covet a neighbor's wife. Thou shalt love thy neighbor. All of those are duties that we are supposed to partake in. And so from a deontological perspective, we need to define how an individual should act. We oftentimes look at religious texts for those definitions, but we can also just look at the golden rule, which actually has basis in religious texts. But if you're not religious, I'm sure you've all heard the golden rule, which says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. In this case, the course of actions that are the correct thing to do that we should take means, let me phrase that. The course of actions that we should take are those actions that we would want another person to take if we were on the receiving end of them. This in and of itself, though, can be problematic because how we prefer to be treated isn't always the right way a person ought to be treated. Because situational and context matters, and a person's experience and backgrounds and their perceptions matter as well. So that means that different people might think different things, different courses of actions are appropriate in the same situation, which means we oftentimes have to have a debate about what the correct course of actions are, what the correct duty is to ascribe onto individuals in those settings. Now, there is a third ethical theory called virtue ethics. And in the virtue ethics approach, we are talking, or let me phrase that. In the virtue ethics approach, it ascribes that individuals should act as a virtuous person would in a given situation. So here, we then have to understand, well, what does it mean to be virtuous? And the Stanford Encyclopedia, which I appreciate, their definition here talks about virtue. And they say virtue is an excellent trait of character. It is a disposition, well entranced in its possessor, something like, as we say, goes all the way down, unlike a habit such as being a tea drinker. To notice, expect, value, feel, desire, choose, act, and react in certain characteristic ways. To possess a virtue is to be a certain sort of person in a certain complex mindset. A significant aspect of this mindset is the wholehearted acceptance of the distinctive range of considerations as reasons for an actions. So within this approach, rather than focusing on questions like what rules you ought to follow or what principles are needed to discern between right and wrong, virtue ethics emphasizes the idea that a virtuous character is all that is needed to arrive at a sound and ethical judgment. In other words, within this approach, we don't look specifically at the actions. We don't look specifically at the consequences. We look at the person who is making the decision. And we say, if that person is a virtuous person, then when the situation, they are bound to make the right decision. They are bound to act in an ethical manner. Now, the positive thing about this is that a virtuous ethics approach means that regardless of the situation, regardless of the context, we will always arrive at an ethical solution because the person making the decision is ethical. The challenging part of this is oftentimes we question whether a decision maker is ethical, whether they are virtuous, whether they're acting in the best sense for everyone involved and not just focusing on themselves or their primary stakeholders if we're talking about management. So we can take these ethical theories and we can start applying them into the world of sports. And there's really two different ways that we can look at ethics in the realm of sports. The first one is look at the interaction of sport and society. Within this view, we see that sport plays an integral role in society, and that through examining ethical issues in sport, we can learn how to approach issues in society as managers as a whole. So we use sport as a microcosm for the world around us. And there's a great Simon article from 2004 that talks about this. And so let me quote it here to you. Simon says, quote, "Those critical of sports or bored by athletic competition must admit that sports play a significant role in our lives, even if they believe that dominance is misguided or even harmful. At the very least, it is surely worth discovering what it is about sports that calls forth a favorable response among so many people from so many different cultures. Reflection upon sport raises issues that not only have intrinsic interest, but also go beyond the bounds of sports itself." In other words, I can use sport and how people view and interact and see sport to learn about society as a whole. So looking at situations like the emphasis on winning and elitism. If I look at the world of sport and I look at what draws people to it, what makes people so interested, one of the main things that we do as sports is we place an extreme level of interest on winning. We want people to win. We care about who the champion is. We celebrate those individuals who win more than other people, regardless of the way that they got there, regardless oftentimes of their skill set. We value winning to an elite level. That's why we put individuals, when we rank them, we value how many championships they've won. We put Charles Barkley well below people like Michael Jordan. Even though he was a great player, even though he did things better than Jordan, we still look at Jordan and say he won. And if we look at that within the world of sports, we can say, wait a minute, why do we care about that so much? Why do we emphasize that so much? And then we can ask ourselves, do we feel the same way about winning and elitism in society? And the answer is yes. We value people who win at life. We celebrate them. We celebrate the self-made billionaire, the person who went from nothing into a champion at life. We promote them. We strive to be them. So through understanding how we do that in sports, we can also understand then how we do that in society. We can look at other things like the growth of commercialization in sport or the growth of social media and media in general. And we can say, wait a minute, how has this happened within the world of sport? Why have we commercialized and turned everything into a money-making endeavor? And we can have those conversations and get at justifications and understandings of that. And then we can take that understanding and say, wait a minute, we do the same thing in society. We commercialize everything. We find a way to turn everything into a product that people can buy and people can make money off of. And so again, using the world of sport, we can take a microscopic lens to certain issues, examine them, and then take and apply them to the real world. Now, the second approach to studying ethics in sports is to use it to examine ethical decision making or managerial decision making. Because as managers, we need to know how to make sound decisions. More specifically, we need to know how to make sound ethical decisions in our recreation and sport organizations. And so understanding ethics in and of itself allows us to understand how to approach different situations, allows us to understand how someone might be able to make a different argument for a course of actions that we should take. So sport not only reflects society's ethical standards, but it also contains its own moral qualities that influence societal structure and institutions. Sports management must confront general and unique ethical problems in administration and organization. Sport managers must acquire this specific knowledge to ensure that they are well equipped to serve and preserve sport in an ethically and morally sound way. So in the end, as DeSanti and Rosenberg say, ethics and morality are generally viewed as critical areas in today's world, and the sport environment is really no different. It is not so much that here may be too many abuses in sports. It is not so much that there may be too many abuses in sports, but that the magnitude, severity, and far-reaching influence of these ills are staggering. In other words, sport is faced with ethical issues just like any other field or just like any other aspect of society. But because of the massive popularity of sport, those issues seem to have a greater magnitude, a greater level of severity. They reach a larger population. And so as managers, we need to not only learn how to deal with those issues so we can make the right decisions and obtain outcomes that we want, but we need to understand why these issues are present, because how we deal with them within sport and their presence within sport has an impact on society as a whole, oftentimes mirroring what is happening on a much larger scale. So now that we hopefully have a general understanding of what ethics is, 3 basic ethical theories, and why we need to learn about this within the field of sport management, hopefully we can now engage in some ethical conversations about intercollegiate athletics and intercollegiate athletic governance. And let's start with a very foundational question, something that we've been talking about throughout the course of the term so far. And that is the foundation of college athletics. And the question is very straightforward. Was the inclusion of sport on college campuses ethical? Was it the right thing to do to allow college students to engage in this structured physical activity? And again, I put this out there because it serves as a stepping stone into our conversation today. Because there is no right or wrong answer. And I want you to keep that in mind as we go through each of the ethical conversations we're going to have from here on out. Rather, I don't care about right or wrong. Rather, what I want to focus on is how we make the arguments from both sides. And I want to try to do that by highlighting the ethical theory that underlies that argument. So if I asked you, was the inclusion of if I asked you, was the inclusion of sport on college campuses ethical? Well, you could throw it back and ask, well, was it the right thing to do? Looking at the actions themselves, was it right? Was it done in the right manner? Did we live up to our duty as college professors, as university administrators, as people who are overseeing the lives of these college students? Well, if we take that deontological approach, we then need to ask sub-questions and say things like, well, what was the purpose of college? And does the college sport fit into that purpose? Well, if we go back, remember from our conversation a couple of weeks ago, the role of college is the purpose. The initial founding was to educate individuals. Individuals primarily being rich white men. And so every decision that was made was done to try to help that outcome. So in that sense, does adding college sport, the action of adding college sport, help us attain the outcome of education? Well, initially, you could argue yes. Remember, college life was highly regulated. Students did not have much free time. They didn't have much time to engage in recreation. They became restless. They started acting out. So we introduced sport to provide them a physical outlet for their energy. Well, that action of introducing sport was done through a highly controlled manner where we first introduced gymnasiums and physical activity, where we then go in and start having some forms of organized sport, all to help the individuals obtain a better education. But the actions itself, there was nothing unethical or wrong about what they did. They didn't cheat, they didn't steal, they didn't violate any morals that we might have. They did these steps or did this with multiple steps to assure that each action didn't hurt education. In fact, only helped it. So if you look only at the action, we are actually helping individuals obtain the outcome that we initially sought within higher education. Therefore, that action would be considered ethical. We can then go on to further say, well, once we start to have college sports on campuses, what do we care about? What do we care about in intercollegiate athletics? Well, initially, we cared about physical education. We wanted individuals to have education. Remember, we talked about the masculine Christianity movement, better understanding of our body, physicality, our movement, helped us have a better understanding of our Christianity, which was a big thing in the 1850s. We also cared about being a gentleman and the ideals of amateurism, that the actions to get to the outcome were more important than the outcome itself. And we initially set up college sport to do that, where we didn't allow intercollegiate athletics. But once we take the action of introducing intercollegiate athletics, now our outcomes that we care about start to change. Winning, revenue production, press, fame, all start to become actions that start to become outcomes that we care more about. But regardless of the outcome change, the actions that we're taking initially, the introduction, the having college sports on campus, those actions can be seen to be perfectly righteous and therefore ethical. But we could change the conversation and say, well, let's not focus on the duties. Let's not focus on the actions. Let's now focus on those outcomes. And if those outcomes are good or bad, and if the number of good outcomes outweigh the number of bad. And you could say that, yes, initially the introduction of sport, the physical education that was tied into it, the fact that it gave individuals the opportunity to get out and be physical, which then helped deal with the challenges of these restless students, all of those could be considered initially to be goods. However, as we fast forward to get into the late 1800s, early 1900s, we could say that the outcomes, the bads of the outcomes start to outweigh them. The focus on winning, the focus on revenue production, the fact that we start to detract, according to the faculty, from education, the ungentleman actions of the athletes. All of those would be bad outcomes. So regardless of if we introduced and implemented sport in an ethical way, the fact from a teleological perspective that the bad outcomes start outweighing the good means that college sport, from its very foundation, an inception into the NCAA, might be marked as being unethical because the outcomes themselves aren't good. The bads are outweighing those. We could also ask from a utilitarian approach and say, look, forget all those other outcomes. Forget the focus on winning, the revenue generation, the promotion, the fact that being a gentleman started to deplete. Forget all that. Did the action of instituting college sport on college campuses, or did the action of implementing sport on college campuses, did that promote as much happiness as possible? Did it make the greatest number of people happy? And you could look at this and say, okay, well, let's look at the people involved. We could look at the faculty of the universities, the staff, university presidents, stakeholders, the athletes themselves, and we just do a balancing act. Did putting college sports on campuses, intercollegiate sports specifically, did that make more people happy or more people upset? Well, from all the research that we've done and all the conversations we had, student athletes' happiness went up. Faculty's happiness went down. Alumni happiness went up. President's happiness went up. So you could argue that the happiness of the individual stakeholders went up with the decision. So from a utilitarian perspective, you could say it is ethical. So three different perspectives, and we can get at the outcome to be very different within each perspective, with each approach that we take. And that's why this is such a good lens in looking at ethics in intercollegiate athletics. Because we've been able to come at two polar opposite answers just by changing our perspective. And so now let's take that approach. Let's take our understanding of how to do that. And let's highlight some of the major ethical issues that we are currently facing in intercollegiate athletics. Now, I'm not going to go through and talk about each of these in depth as I just did with that last example, but I do want to highlight them because I want you, as future sport managers, as individuals who are interested in learning about what's happening in intercollegiate athletics, I want you to apply this thought process that we have gone through to these situations. So that way, if you're ever in a governing role or ever in a leadership role within this setting, you know how to attack the problems that we are going to mention. So the first set of ethical issues that I want to point out are ethical issues tied to athletes' rights and their overall welfare. And the most commonly discussed one is the compensation of student athletes. And we can boil it down to the question of how do we compensate student athletes in an ethical manner? How do we make sure that student athletes are receiving something of value out of all the work and effort that they put in? Does that look like providing them with NILs, which we'll talk here in a couple weeks? Does that mean letting them go out and make money off their name, image, and likeness through sponsorship deals, through posting on social media, through brand association? Does that mean directly paying them, taking in money from the athletic department through their revenue generating means, and then taking some of that money and divvying it up among those individuals that helped me make it? Or does it mean providing them with free education and scholarship money? How do we approach compensating student athletes in an ethical manner? Well, you could have arguments that each of these are both ethical and unethical. For example, you can argue it's unethical not to pay student athletes for their time, effort, and role in revenue generation. You could very clearly say, look, college sports generates millions and billions of dollars, depending on the level that we're talking about. They generate that money on the backs of the athletes. Without the student athletes, without their work, without their labor, there would be no revenue. Therefore, I could argue it's unethical not to allow them to receive compensation for their role. And so I could say not directly paying student athletes is unethical. In that case, within that argument, I looked at the outcome. The outcome is paying student athletes. That's the outcome I care about. So whatever course of actions that I take, I want to set those up so that I allow student athletes to be paid. The problem then becomes, if we value that outcome in a teleological perspective, then we have to take a step back. We have to say, how do we do that? I don't care whether the actions that we're taking, the duties that we're ascribing, I don't care if they're moral or not. But I need to put in place a step of actions that I can subscribe to that allows the student athletes to achieve some type of financial payment from athletics. Well, direct pay would say, I have to have a system in place that ascribes that this money comes in, and then I break that up and I pay student athletes X amount of money depending on different categories or different criteria that I establish. But then I also have to say, okay, well, how do I decide who gets what money? How do I break that down? I still have to follow Title IX bylaws, so I have to make sure that women have equal access to this money. But do I only pay the top performing athletes and pay them a ton of money? Do I give everyone a little bit of something? But then you could argue, well, that's not fair. If everyone gets a little, then the athletes that did the most work, that generated the most money, aren't being equally compensated for their input into the system. So you can see very quickly where the idea, if the good I'm ascribing to do is direct paying student athletes, that's a good ethical outcome to try to ascribe to from a teleological perspective. The problem is, what step of actions can we put in place that allow us to do that good? And when we say pay student athletes, are we saying pay the greatest number of student athletes that we possibly can, even if they're only getting $1 each? Or are we saying that we need to pay those athletes that contribute the most all the money because they're the ones that are in charge of generating it at the cost of maybe not paying people who didn't help generate it, even though they are also student athletes? Universities initially dealt with this through the idea of scholarship allocation. We allow the payment in the form of a scholarship to be given out equally to men and women on college campuses. That's one of the values of Title IX. It talks about how scholarship needs to be broken up. It puts into place those action steps to try to lead to that outcome. And for years, that outcome was seen as just, especially early on when we instituted it in the 1950s. But as universities made more money and scholarship amounts stayed roughly the same, we started saying maybe that outcome isn't justified. Maybe that outcome isn't enough. And so you can see the question of should we do this, of should we pay, should we compensate, that's easy. That's an easy conversation. The question of how do we do it in an ethical manner, that's the one that gets super complicated. And that's the one that governing systems are dealing with. And when we have that conversation about things like NIL and direct pay later this term, hopefully you'll have some perspective now about how we can approach and solve that problem. Another athlete's right and welfare issues deals with this question of, are athletes employees? What we call the employment status debate. Now you might say, well, again, why does that matter? But remember, in our earlier conversations, when we talked about the creation of the term student athlete, that was not just something that came out of nowhere. Walter Byers, the president of the NCAA, created that term following the NCAA losing a lawsuit in which an individual sued the NCAA, claiming that they were an employee and that thus they were entitled to certain benefits like workman's compensation. The student athlete won that lawsuit, and then Walter Byers creates the term student athlete when they're faced with a second workman's comp lawsuit. And the theory is that the NCAA would cease to exist if they lost that lawsuit. So they created this term student athletes to try to say to the courts that this is an extracurricular activity, just like band, just like student government. And that these individuals who were participating in this, they were students that just happened to be athletes. Not they were athletes that just happened to be students. And the creation of this marked the fact that these individuals are not employees. And as a result of that, they're not entitled to certain employee benefits, like workman's compensation. And as a result, we have treated student athletes the same manner for the last 70 years. We've even tried to codify this into law. If you look at state NIL laws, those state NIL laws specifically say even though student athletes are making money from their name, image, and likeness, they are by definition not employees. If you look at the newest NCAA bylaws, which talk about direct pay to student athletes, in those bylaws, it specifically says these individuals are not employees. Well, is it unethical to treat student athletes who contribute a great amount of labor to the university that generate a great amount of money? Is it ethical to not consider them employees? What about the question of how do we balance the idea of health and safety with the goal of winning at all costs? We value winning within sport. Well, how do we value that while also taking care of the student athlete's health and well-being? Especially in sports like baseball, we have high injury risks, things like Tommy John, muscle injuries. Sports like football, where we have concussions and long-term damage from that. I played soccer in college, suffered 9 different injuries, had 9 different surgeries, long-term consequences from that. But if we're trying to win and that's the only outcome that we value, then the health and safety kind of goes out the window because the actions that we take to get to winning don't matter. So how do I take a deontological perspective and say, no, the actions matter. Not just winning matters, the outcome, but the steps we do to get there. So a deontological perspective and approach here would say, how do we balance these things? How do we take care of student athletes' health? How do we make sure that they feel safe? How do we make sure that they don't have too many time demands, that they have time to be a student, that they have time to balance out their academic success with also the fact that we care about winning? We can move to talk about other ethical issues around academics specifically. Just like the initial question that I proposed when I said, was the inclusion of sport on college campuses ethical at its inception? We can ask the same thing now, and we can talk about how academics ties into that. We just spoke about the introduction of the term student athlete and how that was introduced. But modern day, we are facing a number of ethical issues specifically around academics, such as questions about academic clustering and eligibility manipulation. For those of you who don't know, academic clustering is taking athletes in and clustering them in certain majors that they tend to be successful in, that they tend to not have a huge time component to, so that way they can maintain their eligibility, take classes, but focus on their athletics even more. Every university has had issues. Let me rephrase that. Many universities have had issues with academic clustering. Even here at WKU, you can look at what majors student athletes attend or student athletes, let me rephrase that. You can look at what degree programs student athletes major in, and you will start to see that there are clusters of student athletes in certain majors. And then there are other majors that do not have any student athletes. Now, I was lucky when I played soccer in college, I was only told there was one major I could not do, and that was architecture, because the time constraints of architecture were just too great. Everything else we were told that we could freely engage in. But now, with the transfer portal and student athletes transferring after their freshman, sophomore, and junior years, we run into major eligibility issues in which the department have to oftentimes manipulate the eligibility perfectly in compliance with the rules, but they have to do that in order to get the student athlete on the field. And if I only care about winning, and that's the thing I value the most, then I'm willing to sacrifice the individual's education. You might say, well, what's the problem with that? Well, if you want to come to WKU and you want to major in biology, and you transferred in after spending 3 years at a different university when you were majoring in business, the athletic department has a tough situation. Do they honor your wishes to put you into biology, even though it's going to make you academically ineligible because you don't meet certain eligibility guidelines like the 20-40-60 rule? Or do they take you and put you into a program that will maintain your eligibility at the cost of you doing something that you really want to do? What's the best ethical course of action? Well, it depends. Do we care more about the outcome in this situation? And if we do care about that outcome, what outcome are we trying to care about? Your happiness, your satisfaction, your education, is that the outcome, or is winning the outcome? So one of the big things you will see within these ethical conversations in intercollegiate athletics is we need to define what outcome we are trying to obtain, or what outcomes we are trying to obtain. Most administrators will say we're trying to maintain high academic achievement and success with high athletic performance. But if push comes to shove, which one are we valuing more? Because if I care about the athletic performance more, then maybe I take shortcuts with the education side. Because if I only care about that outcome, remember, how I get to that outcome becomes amoral. It doesn't matter. As long as I achieve it, that's what matters. In a deontological perspective, now I'm going to focus on the steps to getting to that outcome. So if I value winning, well, how do I get there? What's the thing that matters the most? So academics faces a number of major ethical issues. What about things like gender equity? We've talked about Title IX and Title IX compliance. You might say, well, how does that face ethical inquiry? Well, how do we go about obtaining compliance? Do we approach it with meaningful compliance or manipulation? Well, for example, Title IX has a series of different ways or series of different steps that we have to follow in order to be compliant with the law. We talked about these. Remember, you have to have proportional scholarship allocation. You have to have equal treatment of the student athletes with things like, you have to have proportional scholarship allocation. You have to treat athletes equitably with the amount and types of resources that they are being given. So meaningful compliance would mean if I get a $10 million gift given to the football team for a football facility, In order to be in compliance with the law, I should go and raise $10 million that was earmarked towards women athletic facilities because I need to make sure that my resource allocation is equitable. And access to facilities is one of those things that we have to meet. So meaningful would be just that. 10 million comes in for men, I go and raise 10 million for women. When I was at Ohio State, that same situation happened. Though it wasn't $10 million, the baseball team got a significant gift given to them for renovations of their football facilities. The Ohio State Athletic Department then went out and raised the same amount of money for the women's softball facility in order to make sure that they were applying meaningful compliance and treating those two programs, those men and women, equitably. Put a different, or on the other side, at my previous institution, we went through a renovation process for our baseball and softball facilities. Now, it just so happened that the two facilities were right next to each other. So when we planned the budget for those facilities, which ran to be about $10 million, we were able to say that that $10 million is going towards both male and female facilities because renovating the entire area. However, if you look at how that money was actually spent on the softball stadium versus the baseball stadium, the softball stadium got about $2 to $3 million, and the baseball stadium got around $7 or $8 million. So we manipulated the setting in order to attain compliance. And as a result of that manipulation, the men and women were not treated equally. From an ethical standpoint, what do I care about? Do I care about only being in compliance? Is that the outcome that I care about? If so, manipulation is perfectly acceptable. It doesn't matter if you think it's right or wrong because this course of action doesn't matter. Or do I care about the steps that I'm taking in order to be compliant from a deontological standpoint? In that case, manipulating the system would be unethical. Doing what Ohio State did and raising the money, equitable funding for two facilities, that would be the best approach. Very common for Division I athletic programs is to receive gifts for football or basketball facilities, use that money and earmark it towards new locker rooms or a new court or a new stadium or improvements. And then say, yes, this is a football stadium, but we're going to allow a women's team, maybe the women's soccer team, maybe the lacrosse team. We're going to, quote unquote, allow them to play on that field. And therefore, that has become a multi-use facility for men and women and not just for football, even though football is the primary user, even though they see the greatest benefits from that. But that's another example of manipulation. You also have things within Title IX, such as roster manipulation, to try to show that you are proportional. They're meeting the proportionality part of Title IX compliance, such as having women on the roster who don't even realize or know that they're on the team, or counting athletes twice. Again, if all I care about is compliance, then those things don't matter. That's perfectly ethical because in the end, I'm compliant and the outcome is the only thing that matters. But if I care about the actions, the duties, the way we get to the outcome becomes important. It's the same thing we could say about cutting programs. If I just want to be compliant, cut all the programs you want. Cut the men's soccer team, the football team, cut the men's soccer team, cut the wrestling team, cut the cross country team. If it makes me compliant, that's the only thing that matters. But if we want to do it the right way, maybe instead of cutting all these teams, if we're trying to maybe get to the good of happiness, of generating the most happiness for the most people, well, maybe I just reduce some funding from some of the bigger programs like football, basketball, baseball, maybe, and I reallocate that funding to the smaller teams. Because in doing that, I've taken a series of actions that have now promoted the most good, so maybe we take that approach. Other questions with ethics in the modern day. Commercialization and capitalism. I talked about the idea of the growth of commercialization in college or the growth of commercialization in sports and how we can use that as a lens to look at the growth of commercialization in society as a whole. Well, we have this same thing in college athletics. And this idea of the growth of commercialization really deals to a lot of inequities. And so the question becomes, how do our governing organizations like the NCAA, like athletic conferences, like the universities themselves, how do they deal with these inequities? In other words, how do they deal with unequal access to resources? We can divide this up and think about this in some very simple terms. Think about in the NCAA, your FBS schools, your football bowl subdivision schools, and then think about your FCS schools, your football championship subdivision schools. Well, both of those are Division One programs. FBS and FCS are both Division Ones. They're just different classifications. Well, FBS schools have access to way more resources than FCS schools on large. Might not be true for every single FBS and FCS school. When we look at the totality of FBS and the totality of the FCS, that statement is true. Now, in football, they're not competing against each other, so it's not a huge deal. What about every other Division One sport? Basketball, baseball, softball, swimming, track and field. FBS programs have more access to revenue. So how do I create a fair and balanced playing field? Or do I even care about creating a fair and balanced playing field? The NCAA talks about having fair and balanced competitions throughout all the divisions. Well, inequitable access to resources makes that virtually impossible. So how do I do that? What steps can I take to get to that outcome that I'm trying to get to? We can look at just within the FBS, the Power 2 conferences, the Big Ten and the SEC. Way more access to revenue, way more access to money, because their TV deals far outpace everyone else in the FBS. So how can a team like WKU with our resources ever compete with a school like Ohio State or Alabama or USC when we don't have equitable resources? So if you want a fair and balanced playing field, if we want to set up football or basketball in a sense where any team within the FBS can win a championship, how do we do that when the resources themselves aren't equitable or equitably distributed amongst those programs? So those become issues dealing with commercialization and capitalism within college sports. Part of that falls onto things like media contracts. How do we balance media contracts and when student athletes are required to travel and play in games and how far they have to travel? How do we balance that with the goal of valuing athlete welfare and well-being? To what extent should we let corporate sponsors influence college sports at all? Sponsors like AT&T, Coca-Cola, now gambling companies like DraftKings, ESPN. How much should we let those companies come in and have say over how we operate? A prime example of this is just to look at the FBS football championship. What do we value the most? What's the outcome that we are trying to obtain? Are we trying to just maximize the revenue that we're producing in the NCAA? Is our focus on capitalism? Well, if that's the case, the current structure is set up pretty well. We have a playoff system. We have a number of teams playing in it. We have a series of games that get major spotlights, that get major revenue. We extend all the way from August into late January. It's perfect. It is designed and set up to maximize revenue production. You could even argue that we should expand the playoffs to give more games because more games means more ad revenue, means bigger TV contracts. Or do I care more about the student athlete themselves? Is the outcome I'm trying to obtain education and valuing that? If that's the case, I probably shouldn't have a sport that extends into multiple semesters, that takes student athletes out of the classroom even more. So regardless of what ESPN or AT&T or Coca-Cola or DraftKings says, maybe the outcome is student athlete welfare and academic success. Maybe we shouldn't allow these corporate sponsors, these corporate entities to have such a say. But this is something that these organizations, the NCAA, the conferences, the colleges, they have to battle this. They have to look at this situation and ask, what is the outcome we are trying to obtain? What is the good that we are trying to get out of college sports? And do we care more about just getting that outcome, or do we care more about the process used to get there? We can also have conversations about governance or institutional questions or DEI issues. Things like, does the NCAA engage in selective punishment? Do they give or equitable due process in all situations? Do they treat bigger colleges differently than they take smaller colleges? If they're only concerned with revenue generation, you probably shouldn't hurt your cash cows like Ohio State, like Alabama, like Oregon. But hurting WKU might not hurt them and their pocketbooks that much. So if I'm trying to maximize revenue production, maybe we don't give equitable treatment in terms of punishment. And a lot of people feel that your bigger colleges, like your Michigans, like your Ohio States, like your Penn States, are not treated fairly, and that smaller colleges are often overpunished. And they would argue that's unethical because if our goal is to treat everyone fairly, then we have now failed to achieve that. If our goal is to maximize revenue, well, the step of actions don't matter in that case. So therefore, it doesn't matter whether I punish people equitably or not. Institutions have to ask questions. Going back to the idea of commercialization, how do we deal with the arms race? How do we balance building facilities and putting money into sports and putting money into athletics as a whole with also making sure with also making sure that academic institutions, our academic side of our university, have enough money to operate effectively as well? Where do we where do we put the money that we are bringing in? And then who should be giving or who should be paying that money? Should that come from students' athletic fees? Should that come from the government? Should that only come from revenue generation? How do we get that money in? And the question becomes, well, how do we even provide oversight? If athletics is driving a lot of what the university's success is and the promotion of the university and the success of athletic program then drives our recruitment of athletes, how do we provide oversight to that? What steps do we take to set up a system to make sure that athletics isn't running the university and that the university is running athletics, if that's the outcome that we're trying to achieve? One of the major ethical questions right now that's currently been through the news, and the NCAA has been dealing with it as well, is how do we govern transgender athletic participation? And you might have some personal beliefs on that, and that's perfectly fine, whatever side you fall on. But just know from an ethical standpoint, there are justifiable arguments on both sides. You could argue that if all we care about is winning, if that's the outcome that we're seeking, winning and revenue generation, then the actions don't matter. In other words, it doesn't matter if I allow transgender athletes to play or if I don't allow them to play. Whatever course of action is going to lead to the outcome I want, that's the thing that matters. So if winning is all that matters, then allow them to play if it helps you win. If it doesn't help you win, don't allow them to play. And that's if the course of action doesn't matter from a teleological view. But if the outcome you're trying to achieve is a fair and balanced playing field, then maybe you argue that it imbalances the playing field, or you could argue it doesn't hurt the playing field. Either argument, again, is focused on the outcome you're trying to obtain. Now, if you say that the process matters, that the individual actions that you take matter, that we have a duty to treat everyone in a fair manner, and that sport participation is something that is virtuous to apply and give to everyone, then from a deontological perspective, you could argue that we should give transgender athletes the right to participate in college sports, because the moral duty is to treat everyone as we wanted to be treated. And if we would want to play in that situation, we would extend that to them. So we can make an argument from an ethical perspective on both sides of the transgender issue within college athletics. So from an athletic standpoint, from a governing standpoint, what we do then is we say, what outcome do we want to obtain? That's the question. What are we trying to get out of this? And then we say, okay, do we care more about the outcome itself in reaching that? Or do we care more about the steps we take to get to that outcome? And based off that answer, we then go and look at the course of actions that we might take, and we ascribe that logic and that thought process to that. We can take all of these ethical questions and we can kind of hone them down into these four overarching ethical concerns in the modern day. The first one, which is something that we spent a lot of time talking about already, is amateurism still defensible? Is the notion of amateur athletics still ethically defensible in the current landscape of the world? Well, in this sense, we would have to break down and talk about what it means to be an amateur. And this is where in college athletics that gets very hard, because as we noted, the definition of amateur has changed drastically since the inception of college athletics, since the inception of intercollegiate athletics in the 1950s. How we define it now, I said in our previous conversation, is it is sports linked to education. But is that still defensible when we're generating so much money off of college athletics and off of the hard work of student athletes? Is it still defensible to call them amateurs? To say that they're not employees? To say that they're not entitled to financial compensation in exchange for their work and their performance? Well, if I set up that way, you probably say no. If the outcome that we care about is amateurism, the current way that we operate does not generate truly amateur individuals. But if you care about academics tied to athletics, you could say, yes, we still have a system that combines the two, so it's still there, present, and we should still work to defend it. What about the question of does the educational model, or let me start again. What about the question, do the educational model and professional model still work together? Can we actually have an amateur system where education and a professional model of athletics, a model in which we are trying to generate revenue, can we still even keep those two things together? Or do we need to just separate them? In the same sense, how do we value both competitive balance and market freedom? Market freedom subscribes to the idea that we're trying to generate the most revenue possible. It's the idea of capitalism. So we take whatever steps to generate the most revenue, generally for our stakeholders. But when I do that, by the very nature of capitalism, we have winners and losers. We have competitive imbalance. Look at any industry. There are major corporations that dominate that industry that make it almost impossible to have competitive balance amongst everyone else. Look at retail, look at Amazon, look at Walmart, look at Target. They dominate the retail market. It's not competitively balanced. But if the end goal is to generate the most revenue, capitalism, then we can't have competitive balance. But if I value competitive balance, if that's the outcome that I want, then I probably can't have capitalism and market freedom. So this is where we need to decide what outcome is, or what the outcome is that we are trying to obtain. And whatever that outcome is, we then say, do we care about the steps to get there? Or do we care about the outcome itself the most? And based off your answer to that question, we can now set in a course of actions to try to act in an ethical manner. To summarize all of this down, to summarize all the conversation about ethics into a single point, the overarching ethical question is, does the good of college athletics outweigh the bad? Just like we talked about when we first defined and talked about ethics in college sport, the same question is still present. Initially, we said, from its inception, was the inclusion of sport on college campuses ethical? Not surprisingly, or maybe surprisingly to you, 150 years later, we are still asking the same thing. Does the good of college athletics outweigh the bad? And we've talked about all the goods. Education, a massive good. Whether you believe that the student athletes are truly getting educated or not, it doesn't matter. If we look purely at the numbers, vast majority of student athletes are receiving an education. Athletes receive an education at a higher rate than non-athletes, meaning they graduate at a higher rate than non-athletes. And many of those athletes, not all of them, but many of them receive a free education. They leave college with a degree, and they leave college with no debt, which you could argue right there, that sets them up for success in life. Not only do they leave with no debt and they leave with the education, the process that they use to obtain the education is oftentimes considered far superior to the process of non-student athletes. They get so much academic support. They get tutoring, they get mentorship, they get advising. All of that is a direct outcome from their participation. Not only can we talk about the good of the education that they receive, but they also receive professional training. Not only talking about their coaches and the professional coaching that they get in their specific sport, but they have access to professional athletic trainers. They have access to professional strength and conditioning coach, people that are teaching them how to be a professional, how to train like professionals, which again, potentially sets them up for success in life. Not only success from having a professional career, quite possibly, but also knowing how to take care of your body, how to live in a healthy manner. There are medical coverage and benefits that student athletes do get. When I was a student athlete, I had multiple surgeries that the university paid for. If you get hurt as an athlete playing your sports or in training for your sport, you are provided medical coverage for that. And I don't have to go through all of the insurance processes. I don't have to wait in long lines. If I need an x ray, I get it immediately. If I need surgery, I get it immediately. I don't have to wait weeks to get into a doctor, to get x rays, to get MRIs. If I'm sick, I went right to the doctor. I went to my trainer, told them, I went right to the doctor's office, was seen that day within that hour. That's an amazing benefit that non-student athletes do not have access to. I get exposure through the media coverage. We put athletics on TV, on social media, on the internet, all over the place, providing massive brand exposure for these individuals, which helps them build a brand which they are now able to capitalize and generate revenue off of. They also get to travel around the world to see places that most people never get to see. I got to go to colleges all over the United States. I got to go to Germany to play soccer, all for free. Experiences that most individuals don't get, definitely most students don't get. And you get lifelong friendships. The people that you play the sports with become your friends for life. These are just a short list of all the goods that come from college athletics. So to know whether this is enough, we have to look at the bads as well. And this is where we get into a lot of those ethical conversations. Things like exploitations, things like injuries, things like student athlete well-being. Many student athletes think, yes, I receive all this stuff, but I feel exploited. My coach has a win at all cost mentality. They don't care about me as an individual. They care about me as a cog in the machine. And so they will sacrifice me in order to win. And I can say when I was a student athlete, I felt that way at times. My college coach at Virginia Tech, after I suffered a season-ending elbow injury and had surgery, basically told me that I was useless to the team, that I had no value, and that he did not want me around because I no longer served his purpose of trying to win, which that idea and that notion of exploitation can have very bad psychological and mental health effects on you. And many student athletes, once they're no longer playing or once they're benched or once they're put aside by a coach, feel exploited, especially when they see the university raking in millions and millions of dollars, sometimes directly as a result of their experience or their performance. And when they're not receiving any of that money back or receiving a very small portion of that money back, and they're struggling to pay rent or struggling to buy food, that can lead to these great feelings of exploitation. Not only that, because we value winning so much, athletes feel this great pressure to win, which can result in psychological effects, which can affect the student athlete well-being. These sports are played at high levels, so even though you do get medical coverage, which is a good, oftentimes individuals are suffering injuries that could affect them the rest of their lives. Specifically when we talk about things like concussions. The amount of student athletes who have received concussions and then suffered as a result of them has grown continuously over the years. We've seen lawsuits challenging that. But those injuries have long-lasting effects that can definitely be ascribed to being a bad thing. And so when we look at, does college athletics still have an ethical base? In other words, does the good of college sport outweigh the bad? The answer really comes to, how do you value these things? And what is the outcome that we are trying to obtain? The NCAA and most athletic departments specifically say the outcome is academic success and athletic success. If that is the outcome that we are trying to obtain, to understand whether athletics is to understand whether intercollegiate athletics is ethical, we then have to say, how do we want to approach those outcomes? Do we care about the way we get there? If we care about the way we get there, then we look at all the bad things that are happening that lead to those successes, quote unquote. And we would say there's too much unethical actions in place. And so intercollegiate athletics is unethical on space. If we look at those outcomes of athletic success and academic success, and we say all that matters is that we have success, meaning that we're having student athletes graduate at a higher rate, that they have high GPAs, that they're achieving success on the athletic field, however you want to define it. If we only care about those things, then we say, yeah, we are achieving those things. It doesn't matter how we got there. So it just matters how we view the problem, how we approach it, that will lead to our understanding of whether something is ethical or not. So if we look at this idea of the interaction of sport and society, and we approach ethics in intercollegiate athletics only from that viewpoint, we can ask the following questions. What can we learn about sports? If we look only at the interaction of sport and society, that talking point that we had about how and why we need to understand ethics, we can ask ourselves, what can we learn about the world as a whole or sport as a whole through focusing only on these ethical things, these ethical topics that we've just spent time discussing? And the major thing that I can take from this is that we used to value education and sport was secondary. We used to value above all else higher education, college degrees. That was the most important thing. But somewhere along the way, as some of these outcomes like fame and money and success, as we valued those things more than the education, we had a switch. And so now we value the sports side more than we care about the education. We value fame more than we value getting a degree. And I can say that because if we look at all these issues, a lot of them deal with the exploitation of athletes, whether something is or is not exploitative, or how we should treat that, or how we should deal with that. And if we only valued the education, those answers become very simple and those problems go away. But because we value sports so much, because we look to sports so much to get satisfaction and joy, and we identify so much of our personality and who we are with that, especially as sport fans, the aspect of the educational side of these student athletes has kind of gone wayward. And we can look at other parts of society as that as well. The value of a college degree is decreasing more and more and more, versus being famous is seen as valuable more and more by our society. Sport is a way to get into that fame, but doesn't even need to be there. As long as people know who you are, as long as you can make money from that, that's the thing that we value now. Not the education, not the job you had to get to that money. Another point about this interaction between sport and society, what we can learn or take away from this conversation about college ethics or ethics in intercollegiate athletics, is the trickle-down effect that this has had. We can look at these issues within college athletics and then say, well, where else do we see those? We also see these in high school sports now, where we have student athletes claiming that they are exploited at the high school level, where we have where we have high schools building massive stadiums trying to maximize the profitability, exploiting student athletes more and more to gain fame, to gain bigger donor bases, to get more money in to the high school. And where will it stop? Will we see that trickle down into youth sports as well? I don't know. But by looking at these ethical situations and identifying them in college athletics, we can see that this problem is starting to arise elsewhere within sport. And we should grab a hold of that and try to get to some answers to these questions so that we know how to act within these other realms of sport. From the managerial side, one of the main questions that we should focus on as we understand all these things now is that resource allocation is a massive issue. And so one of the major ethical concerns that we should have in governance of intercollegiate athletics is how do we allocate resources? Most of you will probably work, if you choose to work in sports, at the university level, meaning in an athletic department. So we can shape that question to say, how should we allocate resources as an athletic department? Should we spread out all the resources equitably? meaning giving each team equal access to the same resources? How much should we worry about the role of Title IX? Are we trying to manage resources in a way that's equitable, or are we manipulating the situation? How do we go about making sure that the teams that generate the most money also get the most money given to them? Or should we not even value that? College athletic departments have been dealing with this issue for a long time. But as we enter this new age of college athletic governance, and we have things like NILs and direct pay, we have even bigger questions about how those resources should be allocated. And hopefully, understanding the ethical conversation, how we approach things from these multiple ethical viewpoints, hopefully that will help you if you're in this situation, not only come up with an answer, but able to justify that approach and be able to argue against the other side. At the national level, we have the same question. How does the NCAA balance equity really between the SEC and Big Ten and everyone else? Even though those teams bring in the money, we can't give them everything. But you also run the risk, if you don't give them majority of the money, that they could just leave and do their own thing. They could take their 40 schools, leave the NCAA, and now all of a sudden put the NCAA in a very difficult situation. So how do we balance trying to have a fair and balanced playing field and creating equality across institutions with also keeping the cash cows happy? There's not an easy solution to this, but this is something that they have to deal with. Another very common ethical question that's being faced from managers is the inclusion of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, in governance decisions. Questions like, how do we decide who to hire? Do we hire the best person for the job, regardless of everything else? The best person gets the job. Or do we try to value creating a diverse workforce in which we have people with multiple backgrounds and perspectives? And that's who we're trying to hire, regardless of maybe who is the most qualified for a given role. This has sparked numerous debates all over the country, not just in sports and athletic departments, but all over the world. People have conversations and debate and talk about this, and they act like there's a single right answer. The truth is, there is not. Both approaches have different benefits to them. Both approaches have different restraints to them or different drawbacks. The outcome that we get from those two approaches are vastly different. If I only hire the best candidates, what tends to happen is our own personal biases come in. Generally speaking, literature has shown that we tend to hire people who are like us, who look like us, who have similar backgrounds, who we can relate to better. And we tend to believe or ascribe that they're the best for the job, but then we create a very homogenous workforce, a workforce that isn't that diverse. And so we're dealing with challenges within collegiate athletics. If we don't have a diverse workforce, we might not be able to attack problems from different angles or see and understand how different stakeholder groups are affected. But if I only value diversity and having people from diverse backgrounds in, I might sacrifice having people more qualified or having people with better experience in that position. And so while I might understand a situation from a diverse perspective, I might not have the intellectual maturity or the experience to deal with that situation in the best way. So two different outcomes. What do we value the most? And then do we care only about achieving that outcome, or do we care about the process? Obviously, we talked about things like transgender athletes and their rights and how we should treat them. That ties into DEI. We talk about things like Title IX and resource allocation specifically to women and how that ties in to DEI and ethical decision making. But what I hope you take away from this conversation more than anything else is just a basic understanding of how we can approach ethical decision making, how we can attack a situation from an ethical perspective in order to arrive at some type of outcome. And Ziegler proposes an ethical decision-making model that I think is simple, straightforward, and easy to keep in mind, not only if you work in the field of sport, but if you work anywhere. And it involves 5 different steps. The first step is we have to identify an issue. Whatever the issue is, we have to identify it, and we have to define it from an ethical perspective. Meaning, We have to define what is the outcome we are trying to obtain. We have to be specific. What is the good that we are trying to do? What's our primary goal? We have to define what that is. And then we have to define different ways that we can approach the problem, generally from a teleological or deontological perspective. So we first identified the issue, we identify and classify the ethical problem. We then move to gather facts. We collect information, both internally and externally. We look at different policies, bylaws, resource allocations, things that we have at our experience. Look at what we've done in the past within given situations. Internally, we look externally. What are our competitors doing? What do other organizations subscribe? What does the ethical code of practice or best practices state that should be done in that situation? You gather all the information that you can. And then we evaluate that information within the realm of the different ethical theories. So we evaluate from a deontological standpoint, we evaluate it from a teleological standpoint. We need to look at the situation from both perspectives. We ask, what do we value? Do we care more about just getting that thing? Or do we care about doing it the right way and getting to that outcome in a way that is ethical? Now, once we've evaluated those alternatives and we've had those ethical debates, we choose a route to take. And we put that plan or that route into action. And the most important thing, maybe, is we don't just put it into action and we leave it. We then come back and we evaluate it. We put in a step-by-step evaluation process where we evaluate the short-term, the midterm, and the long-term consequences and outcomes of that course of action. And if it's not achieving what we're trying to achieve, we need to come back and adjust it. So often people put in a course of action, they let it go, and they take too long or don't come back and evaluate it at all. So identify the issue, we gather the facts, we evaluate all the potential actions that we can take from an ethical standpoint. We pick something and we put it into practice, and then we continuously evaluate the actions that we've taken, the outcomes that we are trying to and hopefully achieving. And then if we need to, the outcome isn't something that we've wanted or not what we have set our goal as, we then come back and we start it all over again. I know this has been a long conversation and discussion of ethics with a ton of theory. But my hope is by defining and talking about ethical theory and showing you different ways in which ethics and ethical conversations have been ascribed to intercollegiate athletics, I've opened your eyes at least a little bit to how we can approach situations from an ethical perspective, regardless of the theory that you ascribe to, so that you can make better decisions in intercollegiate athletics or in your life or whatever realm of sport or work you go into. As always, if you have any questions, concerns, comments, thoughts, please feel free to reach out and ask. I'm more than happy to engage in any one of these topics with you more in depth. If I don't hear from you, I hope you have a great week, and I look forward to talking to you next time.